Behind the gilded gates of Ethermore Palace, where ancient traditions clash with modern ambitions, a storm has been brewing for months. What happens when two of the most powerful women in the kingdom, one born to nobility, one who married into it, finally face each other with no cameras, no advisors, and no escape? In a world where a single word can topple governments and a glance can start wars, some confrontations are inevitable. This is the story of such a moment, when years of buried resentment, whispered accusations, and carefully maintained facades finally shatter in the marble corridors of power. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Ethermore Palace like a shroud, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens where centuries of royalty had walked before. Lady Isabella Ravencrest stood at the tall windows of the blue drawing room, her fingers drumming silently against the cold glass as she watched the groundskeepers tend to the rose beds below. At 35, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that seemed carved from marble itself. High cheekbones, platinum blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, and ice-blue eyes that could freeze a room with a single glance. Isabella had been born into this world of privilege and protocol, the daughter of Duke Frederick Ravencrest, one of the kingdom's oldest and most respected noble families. Her bloodline could be traced back 12 generations to the founding of Ethermore, and she wore that heritage like armor. Every morning, she woke in her ancestral estate knowing exactly who she was, where she belonged, and what was expected of her. The Ravencrest family had served the crown for over 3 centuries, producing generals, diplomats, and advisors who had shaped the very foundation of the kingdom. But now, as she stood in the palace that had once felt like a second home, Isabella felt like a stranger in her own birthright. The source of her discontent had a name, a face, and, unfortunately, a title that outranked her own: Queen Consort Vivian Ashford. The very thought of Vivian made Isabella's jaw tighten. 5 years ago, the woman had been nothing more than Vivian Morrison, a successful but ultimately ordinary businesswoman from the middle class. She had built a modest fortune in sustainable fashion, traveled the world, and lived a life that, while comfortable, was completely separate from the rarefied air of royal circles. Then, at a charity gala that Isabella herself had organized, Vivian had caught the eye of King Alexander Montclair. The courtship had been swift, passionate, and very public. The media had fallen in love with the story, a self-made woman winning the heart of a king. Alexander, who had been a widower for 3 years following the tragic death of his first queen, seemed to come alive again in Vivian's presence. The wedding had been called the event of the century, watched by millions around the world who saw it as a modern fairy tale. Isabella had watched it all with growing horror, not because she harbored romantic feelings for the king. Their relationship had always been that of close family friends, but because she saw what others seemed blind to. Vivian was ambitious, calculating, and utterly ruthless beneath her charming exterior. She smiled for the cameras while systematically dismantling centuries of tradition. She spoke of modernizing the monarchy while quietly pushing aside those who represented its historical foundations. The changes had started small: a new dress code for palace staff, updated protocols for state dinners, the replacement of the royal florist who had served the family for 40 years with someone younger and more contemporary. Each change seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of a woman determined to remake the institution in her own image. Then came the more significant alterations. Ancient ceremonies were shortened or eliminated entirely. The Royal Advisory Council, which had included members of the Ravencrest family for 200 years, was restructured to include more diverse voices, which somehow translated to fewer hereditary nobles and more of Vivian's personal allies. Most recently, there had been whispers about changes to the succession laws, modifications that would give Vivian unprecedented influence over the future of the crown. Isabella's father had been the first to raise concerns, though he had done so privately and with the diplomatic tact that came from a lifetime of court politics. "There's something about her," Duke Frederick had confided to his daughter during one of their weekly dinners at Ravencrest Manor. "She smiles and nods and agrees with everything, but then somehow things always end up going exactly as she wanted them to. The Duke's concerns had proven prophetic. 3 months ago, he had suffered a massive stroke during what was supposed to be a routine meeting with the king. The official story was that it had been a tragic medical emergency, entirely unrelated to the stress of court politics. But Isabella knew her father, knew his health, and knew that the man who had survived diplomatic crises and political upheaval for decades had been pushed to his breaking point by something or someone. Frederick Ravencrest now lay in a private medical facility, his condition stable, but his speech limited and his memory fragmented. The doctor spoke optimistically about partial recovery, but Isabella saw the truth in her father's eyes when she visited him each day. The sharp intelligence was still there, but it was trapped behind barriers of damaged neural pathways and frustrated communication. During her father's illness, Isabella had assumed many of his duties as the unofficial representative of the noble families. It was in this capacity that she had requested today's audience with Queen Consort Vivian. The official reason was to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival, an ancient celebration that honored the kingdom's agricultural heritage. But Isabella's true purpose was far more confrontational. She had discovered something that could change everything. 3 weeks ago, while reviewing financial records related to her father's charitable foundation, Isabella had stumbled upon a series of transactions that didn't make sense. Money moving between accounts, payments to consulting firms that seemed to exist only on paper, and, most troubling of all, a paper trail that led directly back to several of Vivian's pre-royal business associates. Isabella had always been good with numbers. It was a skill her father had insisted she develop, saying that understanding money was understanding power. What she had found suggested a level of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple business dealings. There were contracts being awarded to companies with connections to Vivian's inner circle, charitable donations being redirected through shell organizations, and, most damning of all, evidence that suggested certain noble families who had opposed recent changes were being systematically excluded from profitable royal contracts. The pattern was sophisticated and carefully hidden, but it was there. Vivian wasn't just changing traditions. She was using the power of the crown to enrich herself and punish her enemies. It was exactly the kind of corruption that had toppled monarchies throughout history. Isabella had spent weeks verifying her findings, cross-referencing public records with private documents, and building a case that would be impossible to deny. She had compiled everything into a leather portfolio that now sat on the mahogany table behind her, waiting for the confrontation she had been planning since the day her father collapsed. The sound of heels clicking against marble announced Vivian's arrival before she appeared in the doorway. Isabella didn't turn immediately, instead using the reflection in the window to observe the woman who had become her nemesis. At 42, Vivian possessed the kind of beauty that came from excellent genetics, expert styling, and unlimited resources. Her auburn hair was cut in a sophisticated bob that framed her heart-shaped face perfectly, and her green eyes held an intelligence that Isabella had to grudgingly respect, even as she despised its application. Vivian wore a navy blue dress that managed to be both elegant and approachable, exactly the kind of carefully calculated choice that had made her so popular with the public. Every aspect of her appearance had been considered and crafted to project the image of a modern queen who understood both tradition and progress. Lady Isabella, Vivian's voice was warm and melodious, with just a hint of the regional accent she had never quite managed to eliminate despite years of voice coaching. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I hope your father is doing well." The inquiry about Frederick felt like salt in an open wound, but Isabella maintained her composure as she finally turned to face the queen consort. Years of court training had taught her to school her expression, to present a mask of polite civility even when her emotions raged beneath the surface. "Your Majesty," Isabella replied with a perfect curtsy that managed to be both respectful and, somehow, condescending. "Father is recovering, though these things take time, as I'm sure you understand." Vivian's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, a moment of calculation that confirmed Isabella's suspicions about the woman's true nature. Of course, medical emergencies can be so unexpected. Please, shall we sit? I understand you wanted to discuss the Harvest Festival arrangements. They settled into chairs that faced each other across a low table adorned with fresh flowers, white roses, and baby's breath arranged in a style that had been traditional at the palace for over a century. Isabella wondered if Vivian realized the significance of the arrangement, or if she simply saw it as another quaint custom to be eventually modernized. The Harvest Festival is indeed important, Isabella began, her voice carefully modulated. It represents one of our oldest connections to the people, a celebration that predates the monarchy itself. My family has been honored to organize the noble family's participation for 8 generations. Yes, I've reviewed the historical records, Vivian replied smoothly. It's a beautiful tradition, though I do think there might be opportunities to make it more inclusive, more representative of our modern kingdom. Perhaps we could involve some of the newer community organizations, bring in fresh perspectives. There was the polite suggestion that would somehow become a firm directive, the gentle push toward change that would diminish another ancient tradition. Isabella had seen this pattern too many times to be surprised by it, but she was still amazed by Vivian's skill in making revolution sound like evolution. Fresh perspectives can certainly be valuable, Isabella agreed, her tone remaining neutral. Though I found that some things become traditions precisely because they work well. Change for its own sake can sometimes do more harm than good. Vivian's smile became more pronounced, and Isabella realized she was enjoying this verbal sparring. I couldn't agree more. That's why I always make sure to thoroughly research any changes before implementing them. I believe in being very careful about understanding all the implications. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with subtext. Isabella felt her pulse quicken as she recognized what sounded like a challenge. Did Vivian know about her investigation? Was this elaborate politeness actually a game of cat and mouse, with both women knowing far more than they were saying? Research is indeed crucial, Isabella replied carefully, especially when it comes to understanding how decisions affect all the people involved. Sometimes the most important implications aren't immediately obvious. They continued their dance of diplomatic language for another 20 minutes, discussing flower arrangements and parade routes while both women measured each other like duelists preparing for combat. Isabella found herself grudgingly impressed by Vivian's skill. The woman never said anything that could be construed as openly hostile, yet every comment carried an undertone of warning. Finally, as the conversation about the festival wound down, Isabella decided it was time to reveal her hand. Your Majesty, if I may, there is actually another matter I hope to discuss with you today. Of course, Vivian replied, though her posture subtly shifted, becoming more alert. Isabella reached for the leather portfolio on the table, her movements deliberate and measured. As you know, my father's illness has required me to take on many of his responsibilities, including the oversight of several charitable foundations and business interests. During this process, I've come across some financial irregularities that I felt you should be made aware of. She opened the portfolio and withdrew a thick sheaf of documents, placing them on the table between them. Vivian's eyes flicked to the papers, and, for just a moment, her careful mask slipped enough to reveal something that might have been concern. What kind of irregularities? Vivian asked, her voice still steady, but lacking some of its previous warmth. Isabella selected the top document and slid it across the table. This is a contract for the renovation of the East Wing Gardens, awarded last year to Meridian Landscaping. The bid was 30% higher than the next closest competitor, yet they were selected. Interestingly, Meridian's parent company is owned by Harrison Properties, which, as I'm sure you remember, was one of your business partners before your marriage. Vivian glanced at the document, but didn't pick it up. I fail to see how my previous business relationships have any bearing on palace contracting decisions. Those choices are made by the Royal Facilities Committee. You're absolutely right, Isabella agreed pleasantly. The committee does make those decisions. However, 3 of the 5 committee members were appointed within the last 2 years, all recommended by your office. And Harrison Properties has received 4 separate royal contracts since her marriage, totaling over £2 million. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vivian's green eyes hardened as she finally reached for the document, scanning it quickly before setting it aside. Lady Isabella, I hope you're not suggesting some kind of impropriety. The committee members were chosen for their expertise and qualifications, not their potential business connections. Isabella withdrew another set of papers from her portfolio. Of course not, Your Majesty. I'm simply presenting facts for your consideration. For instance, these documents show that the Ravencrest Foundation's annual grant for youth education programs was reduced by 40% this year, despite our organization receiving the highest efficiency ratings in the kingdom. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. Interestingly, the same amount that was cut from our funding was awarded to New Horizons Educational Initiative, an organization founded just 18 months ago by several individuals who work for your sustainability consulting firm. Vivian was no longer even pretending to smile. She sat back in her chair, her expression carefully neutral as she studied Isabella with new intensity. I see you've been very thorough in your research. Knowledge is power, Isabella replied, echoing her father's favorite saying. And in my family, we've always believed in being well-informed about matters that affect the kingdom. The two women stared at each other across the table, the pretense of politeness finally abandoned. Isabella could see Vivian calculating, weighing options, deciding how to respond to what was clearly a direct challenge to her authority and methods. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this information? Vivian asked finally. Isabella carefully returned the documents to her portfolio before responding. I'm hoping to ensure that the traditions and institutions that have served this kingdom for centuries continue to be respected and preserved. I'm hoping that decisions are made based on merit and historical precedent, not personal connections and modern whims. And if I were to suggest that your concerns might be motivated more by personal grievance than institutional preservation, the question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make Isabella appear petty and vindictive. But Isabella had expected this line of attack and was ready for it. Then, I would suggest that the evidence speaks for itself, she replied calmly. Financial records don't lie, and patterns don't emerge by accident. If you believe my motivations compromise the validity of this information, I would encourage you to conduct your own investigation. Vivian stood abruptly, her movement fluid and controlled despite the tension in the room. Isabella rose as well, and for a moment they faced each other like queens of opposing armies. Lady Isabella, Vivian said, her voice carrying a note of finality, I appreciate your dedication to the kingdom's welfare. However, I think you'll find that the monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it has been able to adapt and evolve. Clinging too tightly to the past can be just as dangerous as abandoning it entirely. Isabella inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the warning without accepting it. Your Majesty, my family has served the crown through 43 monarchs, including times of war, plague, and revolution. We have learned that some things are worth preserving precisely because they have proven their value across centuries of change. The standoff stretched between them, neither woman willing to be the first to look away. Finally, Vivian moved toward the door, but she paused before leaving. I trust this conversation will remain confidential, she said, not bothering to make it sound like a request. As confidential as you choose to make it, Isabella replied evenly. After Vivian left, Isabella remained standing in the blue drawing room for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The battle lines had been drawn, and there would be no going back now. She had fired the first shot in what could become a war that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Outside the tall windows, storm clouds were gathering over the palace grounds, and Isabella couldn't help but see them as an omen of things to come. Part 2 of the news reached Isabella at precisely 6:47 a.m., delivered by her longtime personal assistant, Margaret Hartwell, who had served the Ravencrest family for over 20 years. Margaret's usually composed demeanor cracked slightly as she set down the morning tea tray with trembling hands. "My lady," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's been a development you need to be aware of immediately." Isabella looked up from the financial reports she had been reviewing at her writing desk in the morning room of Ravencrest Manor. The past week since her confrontation with Vivian had been filled with an ominous quiet, like the stillness before a devastating storm. She had expected retaliation, but not this quickly. "What is it, Margaret?" "The palace has announced that your father's position on the Royal Advisory Council is being suspended indefinitely due to his medical condition. Furthermore, effective immediately, the Ravencrest family's hereditary role in organizing the Harvest Festival has been transferred to a new committee headed by Lord Chancellor Pemberton." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Lord Chancellor Pemberton was one of Vivian's most loyal supporters, a man who had risen rapidly through the ranks since the Queen Consort's arrival. The loss of the Advisory Council position was painful, but expected. Her father's stroke made his participation genuinely difficult. But the Harvest Festival was different. That responsibility had been theirs for over 2 centuries, passed down through generations as both an honor and a duty. "There's more," Margaret continued reluctantly. "The Royal Charities Commission has announced a comprehensive audit of all major foundations associated with noble families. The Ravencrest Foundation is first on their list." Isabella closed her eyes, recognizing the sophisticated nature of Vivian's counterstrike. By targeting the foundation, the Queen Consort was threatening not just Isabella's family legacy, but the livelihoods of hundreds of employees and the welfare of thousands of beneficiaries. It was exactly the kind of leverage that could force Isabella to retreat from her accusations. "When does the audit begin?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Tomorrow morning. They've requested access to all financial records dating back 5 years." Isabella nodded grimly. The audit would undoubtedly be thorough and legitimate. Vivian was too smart to use obviously corrupt tactics. Instead, she would weaponize bureaucracy itself, using the power of regulatory oversight to punish opposition and create the appearance of impropriety where none existed. "Margaret, please arrange a meeting with our legal team for this afternoon. Also, I want you to contact Thomas Blackwood and ask him to come to the manor this evening." Thomas Blackwood was Isabella's oldest friend and, more importantly, one of the kingdom's most respected investigative journalists. They had known each other since childhood, when his father had served as the Ravencrest family's head groundskeeper. Thomas had earned his position at the Telegraph through talent and determination, building a reputation for fairness and accuracy that made him influential across all levels of society. After Margaret left, Isabella walked to the large portrait gallery that dominated the east wing of Ravencrest Manor. Generations of her ancestors looked down at her from oil paintings, their faces bearing the same proud bearing and determined expressions that Isabella saw in her own mirror each morning. Duke Charles Ravencrest, who had helped establish the kingdom's first parliament. Lady Catherine Ravencrest, who had negotiated the peace treaty ending the border wars. Duke William Ravencrest, who had modernized the kingdom's agricultural system during the Industrial Revolution. Each portrait told a story of service, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. But they also told stories of courage in the face of opposition, of standing firm when principles were at stake. Isabella drew strength from their painted gazes, feeling the weight of centuries of honorable service settling on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The sender was listed only as a friend, but the content made her blood run cold. "Check tomorrow's Herald. Some secrets are harder to bury than others." Isabella stared at the message, her mind racing. The Herald was the kingdom's most sensational tabloid, known for its willingness to publish rumors and speculation that more respectable publications would never touch. If someone was preparing to release damaging information about her family through that outlet, the damage to their reputation could be irreversible. She tried calling the number, but it went directly to voicemail with a generic automated message. The text appeared to have been sent from a burner phone, making it impossible to trace. Isabella deleted the message and tried to push it from her mind, but the words echoed ominously. Some secrets are harder to bury than others. The day passed in a blur of legal consultations and crisis management. Isabella's attorneys assured her that the Ravencrest Foundation's records were impeccable. They had been audited regularly by independent firms and had always received the highest ratings for transparency and efficiency. But they also warned that even a legitimate audit could be devastating if conducted with hostile intent. The problem, explained James Morrison, the family's longtime legal counsel, is that any large financial operation can be made to look suspicious if someone examines it with the right preconceptions. They can question every decision, demand explanations for every unusual transaction, and create delays that make normal operations impossible. Isabella understood the strategy. Vivian didn't need to prove actual wrongdoing. She just needed to create enough doubt and disruption to neutralize Isabella as a threat. The Foundation would become so mired in regulatory proceedings that Isabella would have no time or energy to pursue her investigation of the Queen Consort's activities. Thomas Blackwood arrived at Ravencrest Manor just after sunset, his familiar figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the main entrance. At 36, he had retained the lean build and quick movements of his youth, though his dark hair now showed streaks of premature gray that Isabella attributed to the stress of his demanding profession. They had always been comfortable together, sharing the easy intimacy of people who had known each other since childhood. Thomas had been her confidant during her rebellious teenage years, her study partner at university, and her most trusted advisor during the political challenges that came with her adult responsibilities. "You look like hell, Izzy," Thomas said without preamble, using the nickname that only he was allowed to employ. "Charming as always," Isabella replied, but she was grateful for his directness. She led him to the library, where Margaret had prepared a light dinner and opened a bottle of wine from the manor's extensive cellars. As they ate, Isabella briefed Thomas on everything that had transpired since her confrontation with Vivian. She shared the financial irregularities she had discovered, the veiled threats from their meeting, and the swift retaliation that had begun that morning. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in the shorthand he had developed during his journalism training. When Isabella finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her with the analytical gaze that had made him such an effective investigative reporter. "The evidence you've compiled is compelling," he said finally, "but it's also entirely circumstantial. Everything you've shown me could be explained as coincidence or normal business relationships. To make this story stick, we would need something more definitive." Isabella nodded, having reached the same conclusion herself. "I know. That's why I haven't taken this to the press or the authorities. But, Thomas, my father didn't have that stroke by accident. I can't prove it, but I know Vivian is behind everything that's happening." "Your instincts have always been good," Thomas acknowledged. "But instincts don't make for publishable stories. What we need is either a smoking gun or someone willing to go on the record with specific allegations." Isabella poured more wine for both of them, considering his words. "What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to prove Vivian's guilt, what if we focused on exposing the pattern of changes she's implemented? Document how the monarchy has been transformed since her arrival. Show how traditional power structures have been systematically dismantled." Thomas's eyes lit up with professional interest. "That's actually brilliant. It's a story that writes itself. The modernization of an ancient institution, told through specific examples and documented changes. We could present it as objective reporting while letting readers draw their own conclusions about the motivations behind the changes." They spent the next 2 hours outlining the approach, identifying key examples of policy changes, personnel decisions, and procedural modifications that had occurred during Vivian's tenure as Queen Consort. The pattern that emerged was striking: a systematic campaign to centralize power while diminishing the influence of traditional aristocratic families. "The beauty of this approach," Thomas explained, "is that we're not making accusations we can't prove. We're simply documenting facts and changes that are already part of the public record. If readers conclude that there's a deliberate strategy behind these changes, that's their interpretation, not our assertion. Isabella felt a surge of hope for the first time since her confrontation with Vivian. This approach could work. It would expose the queen consort's methods without requiring the kind of definitive proof that might be impossible to obtain. As Thomas prepared to leave, Isabella walked him to the main entrance. The night air was crisp and clear, filled with the sense of autumn that reminded her of harvest festivals from her childhood. "Thomas," she said as he reached his car, "there's something else you should know. I received an anonymous message today suggesting that tomorrow's Herald will have some kind of story about my family. I don't know what it might be, but I wanted you to be prepared." Thomas frowned, his expression growing serious. Anonymous tips are usually either completely worthless or devastatingly accurate. "Is there anything in your family's history that could be weaponized against you?" Isabella considered the question carefully. The Ravencrest family had served the crown for centuries, but that didn't mean they were without secrets. Every old family had skeletons in their closets, financial difficulties, personal scandals, political misjudgments that had been carefully managed and gradually forgotten. "Nothing recent," she said finally, "but with enough digging and the right spin, almost anything can be made to look bad. My great-grandfather had some questionable business dealings during the war years. There was a minor scandal involving my aunt's first marriage. The kind of things that were handled discreetly at the time, but could be presented differently now." Thomas nodded grimly. That's exactly the kind of material that tabloids love to resurrect. Old scandals with just enough documentation to seem credible, but not enough context to tell the full story. After Thomas left, Isabella found herself unable to sleep. She wandered through the manor's familiar rooms, drawing comfort from the solid presence of furniture and artwork that had been collected across generations. The building itself seemed to radiate stability and permanence, a physical manifestation of everything she was fighting to preserve. At 3 a.m, she finally gave in to her anxiety and drove to an all-night newsstand in the nearby village. The proprietor, an elderly man who had known her since childhood, handed over a copy of the Herald with a sympathetic expression that told her everything she needed to know. The headline screamed across the front page in bold red letters, "Noble Family's Nazi Gold. Exclusive documents reveal wartime collaboration." Isabella's hands trembled as she read the article, which detailed allegations that her great-grandfather, Duke Edmund Ravencrest, had profited from business dealings with Nazi Germany during the early years of World War II. The story included photocopied documents that appeared to show financial transactions between Ravencrest companies and German firms, along with quotes from unnamed historical researchers suggesting that the family had been slow to cut ties with German business partners even after the war began. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and selective presentation. It acknowledged that many British businesses had maintained relationships with German companies before the war, and it noted that the Ravencrest family had ultimately made significant sacrifices for the war effort, including the loss of Isabella's great-uncle in the Battle of Britain. But these contextual details were buried deep in the story, while the inflammatory allegations dominated the headline and opening paragraphs. Isabella drove home in a daze, recognizing the sophistication of the attack. The documents appeared to be genuine, old financial records that had probably been gathering dust in some archive for decades. But they were being presented without proper historical context, stripped of the nuance and complexity that would be necessary for fair evaluation. More importantly, the timing was perfect. The story would dominate news cycles for days, forcing Isabella to respond to historical allegations rather than pursuing her investigation of contemporary corruption. Every interview, every public appearance, every statement would now have to address these wartime accusations, leaving no space for her concerns about Vivian's activities. Back at the manor, Isabella found Margaret waiting in the kitchen with tea and a grim expression. News traveled fast in small communities, and the overnight shift at the newsstand had undoubtedly already begun spreading word of the Herald's bombshell. "The phone's been ringing constantly," Margaret reported. I've had calls from reporters, photographers wanting permission to access the grounds, and several television news programs requesting interviews. Isabella nodded, recognizing that her life had just changed irrevocably. By morning, Ravencrest Manor would be surrounded by media vans and curiosity seekers. Her privacy, her family's reputation, and her ability to move freely in public had all been casualties of Vivian's preemptive strike. "Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the week," Isabella instructed, "and contact our attorneys immediately. We need to prepare a comprehensive response to these allegations, something that puts them in proper historical context." As dawn broke over the manor's grounds, Isabella stood once again in the portrait gallery, looking up at the painted image of her great-grandfather. Duke Edmund gazed down at her with the same proud bearing that characterized all the Ravencrest portraits, but now Isabella wondered what secrets those painted eyes might hold. The battle with Vivian had escalated beyond anything she had imagined, and Isabella realized that she was no longer fighting just for political influence or family traditions. She was fighting for the very survival of everything the Ravencrest name represented. Outside, the first news van was already pulling up the long drive to the manor, its satellite dish gleaming in the early morning light like a weapon aimed at the heart of her ancestral home. Part 3: The Siege of Ravencrest Manor began at dawn and showed no signs of ending as the third day stretched toward evening. Isabella watched from her father's study window as reporters and photographers maintained their vigil beyond the estate's iron gates, their equipment creating a forest of tripods and satellite dishes that transformed the peaceful countryside into something resembling a military encampment. The Herald's story had exploded across all media platforms with the devastating efficiency that only a perfectly orchestrated scandal could achieve. By the second day, it had been picked up by international news outlets, with headlines in French, German, and Spanish newspapers breathlessly reporting on the Nazi gold scandal that was rocking the British aristocracy. Isabella's legal team had worked around the clock to prepare their response, but they faced an almost impossible task. The documents presented in the Herald were genuine, though taken completely out of historical context. Duke Edmund Ravencrest had indeed maintained business relationships with German companies in the years leading up to World War II, as had hundreds of other British businessmen during a period when such connections were not only legal, but actively encouraged by the government as part of international commerce. The fuller picture, which Isabella's historians and researchers had painstakingly documented, showed that Edmund had severed all German connections immediately upon Britain's declaration of war, had converted his factories to wartime production at significant personal cost, and had lost his youngest son in the RAF's desperate defense of London during the Blitz. But nuance and context were poor weapons against sensational headlines and carefully edited documents. The problem, explained Victoria Sterling, the crisis management specialist Isabella had hired on Thomas Blackwood's recommendation, is that we're fighting a narrative war, not a factual debate. The truth is complex and requires careful explanation, while the accusations are simple and emotionally powerful. Victoria was a sharp-edged woman in her 50s who had built her reputation managing scandals for politicians and celebrities. Her assessment of Isabella's situation was brutally honest. Your great-grandfather's wartime business dealings provide just enough factual foundation to make the Nazi collaboration narrative seem plausible to casual observers. Even if we completely debunk every allegation, the association will linger. Isabella understood the dynamics at work. Vivian had chosen her weapon perfectly. Historical accusations that were impossible to fully disprove, tied to events that evoked powerful emotional responses, timed to coincide with Isabella's vulnerabilities. The Queen Consort hadn't needed to prove Isabella was guilty of anything. She had only needed to make her seem tainted by association. The counterattack came on the fourth day, delivered with the same surgical precision that had characterized all of Vivian's moves. Isabella received the news through a phone call from Thomas, whose voice carried a mixture of admiration and dread. "She's good, Izzy. Disturbingly good." Thomas had been monitoring the palace's response to the scandal, watching for any sign of how Vivian planned to capitalize on Isabella's wounded position. The answer came in the form of an exclusive interview that the Queen Consort had granted to the BBC's most respected news program. Isabella watched the broadcast from her father's study, surrounded by legal documents and crisis management strategies that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. Vivian appeared on screen looking every inch the modern royal. Elegant but approachable, serious but compassionate. She wore a simple black dress that conveyed appropriate solemnity, and her auburn hair was styled in a way that suggested she had been too busy with important work to spend much time on personal grooming. The interviewer, David Ashworth, was known for his aggressive questioning and his ability to expose weaknesses in even the most polished public figures. But with Vivian, he seemed almost deferential, asking thoughtful questions that allowed her to present herself in the most favorable light possible. "Your Majesty," Ashworth began, "the recent allegations involving the Ravencrest family have raised questions about the role of hereditary nobility in modern Britain. How do you think the monarchy should respond to revelations about the wartime activities of prominent aristocratic families?" Vivian's expression conveyed just the right mixture of sadness and resolve. "David, first, I want to be absolutely clear that I have enormous respect for the sacrifices made by all British families during the war years. Many noble families, including the Ravencrests, lost sons and daughters in service to our country, and those sacrifices should never be forgotten or diminished." It was a masterful opening, acknowledging the family's losses while subtly reinforcing the allegations about their wartime activities. Vivian continued with equal skill. "However, I do think these revelations highlight the importance of transparency and accountability in our modern democracy. The monarchy serves at the pleasure of the people, and that service must be based on the highest standards of ethical conduct. When questions arise about the historical actions of those who hold positions of influence, I believe we have a duty to address those questions honestly and openly." Isabella felt sick as she recognized the perfection of Vivian's positioning. The Queen Consort was presenting herself as the voice of modern moral standards, calling for accountability and transparency while simultaneously suggesting that Isabella and families like hers represented an outdated system of hereditary privilege that might be incompatible with contemporary values. Some critics have suggested that your recent reforms to royal protocols and advisory structures represent an attack on traditional institutions, Ashworth continued. "How do you respond to those concerns?" Vivian's smile was patient and understanding, like a teacher explaining a complex concept to a confused student. "I think those criticisms reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're trying to accomplish. The monarchy's greatest strength has always been its ability to evolve and adapt to serve the needs of each generation. The traditions we preserve are those that continue to have meaning and relevance, while the customs we modify are those that may have outlived their purpose." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more earnest. "The question isn't whether we should honor our history. Of course we should. The question is whether we should allow that history to limit our ability to serve the people of today. When I look at the advisory structures that have guided royal decision-making for centuries, I see institutions that were designed for a very different world. Our goal is to preserve what's valuable while making room for voices that represent the full diversity of modern Britain." Isabella recognized the devastating effectiveness of the argument. Vivian was recasting her systematic dismantling of traditional power structures as a noble effort to democratize the monarchy. Opposition to her reforms could now be portrayed as elitist resistance to progress and inclusion. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Vivian deftly addressing questions about modernization, transparency, and the balance between tradition and progress. She managed to appear both respectful of the past and committed to the future, both humble about her own role and confident in her vision for change. When Ashworth asked about the specific challenges facing the monarchy, Vivian's response was particularly pointed. "I think one of our greatest challenges is ensuring that the voices we listen to truly represent the full spectrum of British society. For too long, royal decision-making has been influenced primarily by a small circle of hereditary advisors whose perspectives, however well-intentioned, may not reflect the experiences and concerns of ordinary citizens. The implication was clear. Families like the Ravencrests were part of the problem, representatives of an insular aristocratic culture that was fundamentally out of touch with modern Britain. Their removal from positions of influence wasn't an attack on tradition. It was a necessary evolution toward more representative governance. After the broadcast ended, Isabella sat in stunned silence, recognizing the completeness of her defeat. Vivian had transformed Isabella's accusations of corruption into a broader narrative about democratic reform and modernization. The Queen Consort wasn't just defending herself against specific charges. She was positioning herself as the champion of progress against the forces of aristocratic privilege. The phone rang constantly over the following days, with reporters seeking Isabella's response to Vivian's interview and photographers hoping to capture images of the embattled noblewoman. Isabella's attorneys advised her to remain silent, arguing that any public statement would only prolong the controversy and provide additional ammunition for her opponents. But silence felt like surrender, and Isabella found herself increasingly desperate to find some way to fight back. The answer came from an unexpected source, her father. Isabella visited Duke Frederick every day at the private medical facility where he was recovering from a stroke. The visits were heartbreaking. Her brilliant, articulate father reduced to frustrated gestures and halting words, his powerful mind trapped behind the barriers of damaged neural pathways. But on the seventh day after the Herald story broke, Frederick managed to communicate something that changed everything. Isabella was reading him updates about the manor's operations when he suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes blazing with an intensity she hadn't seen since his illness. "Box," he managed to say clearly, the word emerging with tremendous effort. "Office hidden box." Isabella leaned closer, trying to understand what he was attempting to tell her. Frederick's study at the manor had been thoroughly searched by the legal team, looking for documents related to the wartime allegations, but they hadn't found anything beyond what was already known. Frederick shook his head in frustration, then pointed toward the window of his hospital room. "Manor," he said with great difficulty. Behind books." It took Isabella several minutes to understand, but finally, she realized what her father was trying to tell her. There was a hidden compartment in his study, concealed behind one of the bookcases. Frederick had mentioned it to her years ago in passing, a secret cache that every duke had maintained for storing the most sensitive family documents. Isabella drove back to Ravencrest Manor with her pulse racing, hope and fear warring in her chest. The media encampment at the gates had thinned somewhat as the story aged, but several photographers still maintained their vigil. She parked behind the manor and entered through the kitchen to avoid being seen. Frederick's study looked exactly as he had left it before his stroke. Books precisely arranged, papers organized in neat stacks, everything reflecting the careful discipline that had characterized his approach to life. Isabella went directly to the wall of leather-bound volumes that dominated the room's east side, running her hand along the shelves until she found the mechanism her father had described. The hidden panel was concealed behind a collection of agricultural journals from the 1890s. When Isabella pressed the correct sequence of leather spines, a section of the bookcase swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a small chamber that contained a steel document box. Inside the box, Isabella found materials that made her hands tremble as she realized their implications. There were financial records dating back to Vivian's business career, documenting transactions and partnerships that went far beyond anything Isabella had discovered in her previous research. More importantly, there were photographs, correspondence, and recorded conversations that painted a devastating picture of the Queen Consort's pre-royal activities. The documents showed that Vivian's sustainable fashion business had been built on a foundation of exploited labor and environmental deception. Her factories in developing countries had maintained appalling working conditions, while her marketing materials promoted ethical production practices. She had systematically defrauded investors by inflating her company's environmental credentials while secretly using the cheapest and most damaging production methods available. But even more damaging were the recorded conversations, apparently gathered through industrial espionage by competing businesses. In these recordings, Vivian could be heard discussing strategies for manipulating media coverage, bribing regulatory officials, and destroying evidence of her company's illegal activities. One conversation in particular made Isabella's blood run cold. In it, Vivian discussed her plans for approaching King Alexander with calculating precision, analyzing his psychological vulnerabilities, and designing a romantic strategy that would position her for maximum political influence. "He's lonely and idealistic," Vivian's voice said from the digital recording. "Still grieving his first wife, but desperate to appear strong and forward-looking. If I could present myself as both a romantic partner and a modernizing influence, I can probably guide him toward whatever changes I want to implement." Isabella realized she was holding evidence that could destroy Vivian completely. Proof of fraud, corruption, and cold-blooded manipulation that went to the heart of the Queen Consort's character and motivations. But she also understood that using this evidence would require her to reveal that her family had been conducting what amounted to intelligence operations against a member of the royal family. The documents suggested that Frederick had been investigating Vivian since before her marriage to the king, gathering evidence of her questionable background, and preparing for a confrontation that had been interrupted by his stroke. Isabella felt a surge of pride in her father's foresight, but also a growing sense of the enormous risks involved in using his research. As she studied the materials spread across her father's desk, Isabella realized that she was holding the power to reshape the entire political landscape of the kingdom. But she also understood that deploying this nuclear option would inevitably destroy her own family in the process. The hidden evidence was unquestionably obtained through illegal means, and revealing it would expose the Ravencrest family to charges of espionage, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy against the crown. Even if Vivian was ultimately brought down by the revelations, Isabella and her father would likely face criminal prosecution and complete social destruction. Yet the alternative was to allow Vivian to continue her systematic destruction of everything Isabella held sacred, to watch helplessly as centuries of tradition and service were swept away by a woman whose entire public persona was built on lies and manipulation. Isabella spent the night in her father's study, surrounded by the evidence of Vivian's corruption and the weight of an impossible choice. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky, and she knew that whatever decision she made in the coming hours would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the monarchy itself. The final battle was about to begin, and Isabella would have to decide whether she was willing to sacrifice everything to expose the truth about the woman who had stolen the crown. Part for the decision came to Isabella not as a moment of dramatic revelation, but as a gradual recognition of inevitability. She had spent 3 days studying her father's hidden evidence, consulting with lawyers who spoke in careful hypotheticals, and wrestling with the moral complexities of using illegally obtained information to expose genuine corruption. The turning point arrived through an unexpected source, a private message from Thomas Blackwood that reached her through encrypted channels he had developed during his investigative work. The message was brief, but electrifying. Palace source confirms major announcement plan for tomorrow. Traditional advisory roles being permanently restructured. Your window is closing. Isabella understood immediately. Vivian was preparing to formalize her destruction of the old power structures, transforming temporary changes into permanent institutions that would be almost impossible to reverse. Once the traditional advisory system was officially abolished, families like the Ravencrests would be permanently excluded from meaningful political influence. That evening, Isabella made her choice. She contacted Thomas through secure channels and arranged a meeting for the following morning at a location where they could speak without surveillance. The ancient chapel on the Ravencrest estate grounds, a building that had stood since the 13th century and whose thick stone walls would defeat any electronic monitoring. Thomas arrived just after sunrise, his face grave with the understanding that their conversation would change everything. Isabella had prepared copies of the most damaging documents from her father's cache, though she had been careful to exclude materials that would reveal the full extent of the Ravencrest family's intelligence operations. "Before you look at these," Isabella said as they sat in wooden pews worn smooth by centuries of worship, "I need you to understand what using this information will cost. My family will likely face criminal charges for obtaining it, and I personally will be destroyed professionally and socially. But if we don't act now, Vivian will succeed in her plan to remake the monarchy in her own image." Thomas studied Isabella's face in the colored light streaming through medieval stained glass windows. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we publish, there's no going back for any of us." Isabella nodded, thinking of her father's frustrated attempts to communicate from his hospital bed, of centuries of Ravencrest service to the crown, and of the systematic destruction of traditions that had given meaning and structure to countless lives. "I'm certain," she replied, and handed over the documents. Thomas spent an hour reviewing the materials, his reporter's instincts immediately recognizing their explosive potential. The recorded conversations alone would be enough to destroy Vivian's credibility, while the financial documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that would likely result in criminal charges. "This is beyond anything I imagined," Thomas said finally. "The evidence of pre-royal corruption is devastating, but the recordings of her strategizing about manipulating the king, that's going to shake the monarchy to its foundations." They spent the rest of the morning planning their approach. Thomas would need several days to verify the evidence and prepare a comprehensive expose that would be impossible to dismiss as fabrication or partisan attack. Isabella would use that time to prepare for the inevitable backlash, including the criminal investigation that would surely follow. "There's one more thing," Isabella said as they prepared to leave the chapel. "I want to confront her directly before the story breaks. She destroyed my family's reputation with lies and innuendo. I want her to know that I'm the one returning the favor with truth." Thomas looked concerned. "That's extremely dangerous, Izzy. If she knows what's coming, she'll have time to prepare countermeasures, maybe even suppress the story entirely." Isabella shook her head. "She won't be able to suppress this. The evidence is too strong, and you're too respected as a journalist. But I need her to know that this isn't some anonymous attack. It's the direct consequence of her own actions." On the day before Thomas's story was scheduled to publish, Isabella requested a final audience with Queen Consort Vivian. The meeting was granted, though Isabella suspected this had more to do with Vivian's confidence in her own position than any genuine desire for reconciliation. They met again in the blue drawing room of Ethermore Palace, but the atmosphere was completely different from their previous encounter. Vivian entered with the bearing of someone who had already won the war, her manner gracious but condescending toward the noble woman whose reputation she had systematically destroyed. "Lady Isabella," Vivian said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm so pleased you accepted my invitation to discuss how we might move forward constructively." Isabella noticed the careful phrasing. Vivian was claiming credit for initiating the meeting, asserting dominance even in their greetings. But Isabella had not come to engage in diplomatic niceties. "Your Majesty," Isabella replied with a curtsy that was precisely correct, but somehow managed to convey subtle mockery. "I thought it important that we speak directly about the future of the kingdom." They settled into the same chairs they had occupied during their first confrontation, but now Isabella felt none of the anxiety that had characterized that earlier meeting. The knowledge of what was coming gave her a sense of calm determination that Vivian seemed to sense but couldn't quite interpret. "I understand that recent events have been difficult for your family," Vivian said with practiced sympathy. "Historical allegations can be particularly painful because they involve people we can no longer defend. But I hope you've come to understand that my reforms are designed to benefit everyone, including noble families who are willing to embrace change." Isabella smiled, recognizing the offer embedded in Vivian's words. The Queen Consort was prepared to rehabilitate the Ravencrest reputation in exchange for compliance with her new order. It was actually a generous offer from someone in Vivian's position. Most victors were not so magnanimous toward defeated opponents. Change can indeed be beneficial, Isabella agreed pleasantly. Though I've always found that the most important changes are often the ones that reveal truth rather than obscure it. Something flickered in Vivian's expression, a moment of uncertainty that suggested she sensed hidden meaning in Isabella's words. Truth is certainly important, though I've found that historical truth can be particularly complex, requiring careful interpretation and context. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. Historical truth is complex, but contemporary truth can be remarkably straightforward, especially when it's documented through recordings and financial records. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vivian's confident smile faltered as she studied Isabella with new intensity, clearly trying to determine whether she was facing a bluff or a genuine threat. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning," Vivian said carefully. Isabella opened her briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper, a transcript of one of the recorded conversations from her father's cache. She placed it on the table between them, close enough for Vivian to read, but positioned so that Isabella maintained control of the document. Vivian glanced at the paper, and Isabella watched as the queen consort's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, a kind of controlled panic that she managed to suppress almost immediately. "Where did you get this?" Vivian asked, her voice steady but lacking its previous warmth. "My family has served the crown for centuries," Isabella replied evenly. "Part of that service has always involved protecting royal interests, sometimes from threats that the crown itself might not recognize immediately. It was a diplomatic way of saying that the Raven Crest had been conducting intelligence operations, though Isabella was careful not to admit to anything that could be used against her in criminal proceedings." Vivian picked up the transcript and read it carefully, her expression becoming more controlled with each line. When she finished, she set the paper aside and looked directly at Isabella. "This conversation, if it's genuine, was recorded without my knowledge or consent," Vivian said. "Using such material would constitute a serious criminal offense." Isabella nodded acknowledgement. Using illegally obtained evidence always carries risks, but sometimes the importance of the truth outweighs other considerations. They stared at each other across the table, both women now understanding that they were engaged in a final confrontation that would determine the outcome of their entire conflict. Vivian was clearly calculating her options, trying to determine how much evidence Isabella possessed and how best to neutralize the threat. "What is it you want?" Vivian asked finally. Isabella had been expecting this question and had prepared her answer carefully. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You destroyed my father's health and my family's reputation through lies and manipulation. You've systematically dismantled institutions that have served this kingdom for centuries, replacing them with structures designed to benefit yourself and your allies. You've corrupted the crown itself by deceiving the king about your true nature and motivations." Vivian's mask of composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. "This kingdom was dying under the weight of its own traditions when I arrived. The advisory system was an insular old boys network that ignored the needs of ordinary citizens. The charitable foundations were more concerned with preserving their own influence than actually helping people. I've modernized institutions that desperately needed reform by stealing from them," Isabella replied calmly. "By awarding contracts to your cronies and punishing families who oppose your changes. By lying about your own background and manipulating your way into a position you were never qualified to hold." Vivian stood abruptly, her composure completely shattered. "You sanctimonious bitch," she said, her careful accent slipping to reveal the harsher tones of her original background. "You sit in your ancestral manner complaining about tradition while the world changes around you. Do you think your precious bloodline makes you special? Do you think centuries of inherited privilege give you the right to judge people who actually worked for what they achieved?" Isabella remained seated, recognizing that Vivian's loss of control revealed more about her true character than any recording or document could convey. I think centuries of service create certain obligations, she replied quietly. Obligations to preserve what's valuable, to protect what's vulnerable, and to expose what's corrupt. Vivian began pacing, her elegant composure replaced by barely controlled fury. Service, she spat. You mean sitting in Parliament, making speeches while other people do the actual work of governing? You mean collecting honors and titles while contributing nothing meaningful to society? Your family's idea of service is showing up to ceremonial events and expecting gratitude for your mere presence. Isabella finally stood, recognizing that the conversation had served its purpose. Vivian had revealed herself completely. The mask of gracious reform had fallen away to expose the calculating opportunist beneath. Your Majesty, Isabella said with perfect formality, I think we understand each other now. You believe that modernization justifies any means, while I believe that some institutions are worth preserving regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow morning, the public will have access to information that will allow them to judge which of us is correct. The reference to timing made Vivian freeze. Tomorrow morning, Isabella smiled for the first time since entering the room. The Telegraph will be publishing a comprehensive investigation into your pre-royal business activities and your methods for influencing royal policy. The evidence is quite thorough. Financial records, recorded conversations, documented cases of fraud, and manipulation spanning several years. Vivian's face went completely white. You can't do this. The damage to the monarchy will be significant, but not fatal, Isabella interrupted. The crown has survived much worse scandals than one corrupt consort. King Alexander is a good man who was deceived by someone he trusted. The people will understand that and support him through the transition. Transition? Vivian asked weakly. Isabella moved toward the door, her purpose accomplished. I assume you'll want to spend this evening considering your options. Resignation and exile would be less damaging to everyone involved in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. As Isabella reached the door, Vivian called after her with desperation, replacing anger. Isabella, wait. We can work something out. I can reverse the changes you opposed, restore your family's positions, make financial restitution. Isabella paused, but didn't turn around. Your Majesty, my father always taught me that some things can't be bought, sold, or negotiated. Integrity is one of them. Justice is another. Isabella left Vivian standing alone in the blue drawing room and walked through the palace corridors for the final time. Tomorrow, everything would change. The woman who had systematically destroyed centuries of tradition would face the consequences of her own ambition and corruption. As Isabella emerged from the palace into the late afternoon sunlight, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with victory or revenge. She had fulfilled her obligations to her family, her traditions, and her own conscience. The cost would be enormous: criminal investigations, social ostracism, and the probable end of her family's political influence, but she had chosen truth over comfort, principle over pragmatism. The next morning, Thomas Blackwood's expose dominated every newspaper and news broadcast in the kingdom. The evidence was overwhelming and the implications devastating. By evening, Queen Consort Vivian had resigned her title and accepted exile to a non-extradition country, while King Alexander addressed the nation with a dignity that restored much of the public's faith in the monarchy itself. Isabella watched the king's speech from her father's hospital room, holding his hand as he followed the broadcast with the sharp intelligence that a stroke had never quite managed to extinguish. When Alexander finished speaking, Frederick squeezed his daughter's hand and managed to speak a single word with perfect clarity: proud. Outside the hospital windows, the sun was setting over a kingdom that had been forever changed by the courage of one woman who had chosen principle over power, tradition over expedience, and truth over comfort. The Ravencrest family's centuries of service to the crown had culminated in this final act of loyalty, not to any individual monarch, but to the enduring ideals that made monarchy itself worth preserving. Isabella knew that tomorrow would bring investigations, legal challenges, and social consequences that would reshape her entire life. But tonight, sitting beside her father and watching a good king reclaim his rightful authority, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from duty faithfully performed and honor preserved against all odds. The crown shadow had lifted, and the ancient traditions that gave the kingdom its strength and character would endure for another generation.